Thanks very much for the warm welcome and for dredging up that quote, which I'll have to explain in a minute. The title of my presentation is Building a Great City, Planning and More. It's not my original title. My original title was I'm from Toronto and I'm here to help you. But I thought perhaps I needed to change that. I'd had bad experiences with that title in other places. A few things, then I'm going to preface my comments and then talk, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. But it's true that I grew up with the earth in my hands. I'm actually from a small farming village in England outside Cambridge. Its name's Triplo. Has anybody heard of Triplo? Oh my gosh. I've done this a lot. You're the second person in my life who's heard of Triplo. The other person said he was from Falmere, which was a village a mile away, exactly a mile. And things were such in the England of the 1960s that we didn't know anybody from Falmere, even though it was a mile. So we grew, we didn't. My mom was the teacher. But in the village we're growing sugar beets. There was a dairy and an egg farm. And I took my children back. I left when I was 9. I took my children back when I was when they were about 10 and 11. And the only difference between 1967 and 2005 was that the egg farm, Parker's Eggs, which used to have a few sheep, now was a sheep farm with a few chickens. And that was the only change. But my grandfather, I lived with my mom and my grandfather. My grandfather had a small garden, and he grew potatoes and fresh mint. So I love fresh potatoes and mint to this day, but I used to play with my soldiers in the garden, and that's why I grew up with the dirt in my hands. So it's probably a sleight of hand to associate it with nature. So first of all, I want to thank you for having me today. I did hear some of the sessions this morning, and I was really impressed with the depth and creativity of the sessions. What I'm going to try to talk about today is a slightly different side of these issues, and one which I think you touched on a little bit yesterday. You know, if we want to ensure that we conserve and preserve farmland so we can help feed ourselves and the next generation, if we want to conserve our natural and beautiful natural areas, particularly the ones that we desperately need for clean water and for clean air, one of the big challenges we face, and this is true across North America, but it's particularly true in Alberta and in Ontario, we're both economically successful provinces. About 6.5 million people live within an hour's drive of Toronto City Hall. They come there for jobs, for opportunity. In the same way in Alberta, in Edmonton and Calgary, people come here for jobs and opportunity. And there is tremendous pressure on our natural spaces from urban sprawl and from the growth that comes as a result of that economic activity. So what I'm going to talk about today is strategies that we used within Toronto to try to welcome that growth into the city in order to create an environmentally sustainable city and region, an economically sustainable city and region, and a socially sustainable city and region. And that's really what I mean by planning and more in my title. You know, when I first ran for mayor in 2003, a reporter said to me, "What's the biggest challenge in the city of Toronto?" And I said, "It's urban sprawl." And it really is. We have some of the best farmland in the world not very far from Toronto, and almost all of it has disappeared over the last 20 years. That's a very, very significant challenge, and it's the built form in those suburban areas, as I'm sure you all know, is single-family homes powered by automobiles. So there are sustainability challenges on multiple levels, climate change, there are water issues, a number of issues, and the philosophy we had in the city of Toronto was to build in the city in a way that was environmentally sustainable, that did acknowledge our challenges in the wet weather flow master plan, as was said, but also ensured that people could have a great, thriving quality of life, economic success, and that success was shared by everybody, not just the people on Bay Street, the people on Main Street as well. So that's the theme of my talk, and I have to start by giving a little bit of history of Toronto, sort of its political history, very quickly. And the first few slides have some wording on them. Ignore that. I borrowed the slides from the internet, and ignore the wording. But what I'm trying to show is what's happened to the city of Toronto since 1954. because I think it's quite relevant to what's happening in Alberta, particularly Edmonton and Calgary, with the pressure you have from the economic success in this province. As you may know, in 1954, the regional government in Toronto was formed at that time by the province. So we had a city government and a regional government, and a good part of what today is Toronto was farmland. So we've gone through this twice. We paved over all the farmland within Toronto, but that wasn't good enough, so we're now paving it over all the farmland outside Toronto. I'm sure that may sound familiar to some here. By the way, in 1954, something else was true. My father-in-law still lived in Thorsby, Alberta. And when I became mayor, my press secretary was Don Wanagus. I don't know if people involved in politics here remember Don. He used to write for the Edmonton Sun on politics, provincial politics, and he was also from Thorsby. So Thorsby, Alberta actually ran Toronto between 2003 and 2010. It's a little-known secret. So this is what happened in 1954. The map's from 59, but this is what happened in 1954. So the city of Toronto in the core is what you think of as downtown Toronto. The municipality of Metropolitan Toronto was started in 1954 with the idea that it would provide joint services over these smaller cities and boroughs. And you'll see there's Forest Hill, which Forest Hill is very wealthy, as you may know, until about 1992, Forest Hill, which was amalgamated into Toronto in 1967, still had garbage pickup that the garbage men had to walk from the truck up the side of people's houses and get their garbage from the backyard. Nowhere else in Toronto got that service, I can assure you. But I use that as an example because one of the reasons for the creation of the regional government at that time was to ensure that growth could be managed by people who looked at the larger picture, not just the hyper-local, but the larger picture. So Metro was responsible for things like transit planning, policing, sewer and road infrastructure, and the townships of Scarborough, North York, and Etobicoke were not exclusively, but very significantly farmland at that point. 60 years ago or so, not very long ago. A few other, 1954, that's when it was created. You can see the roads. 1967, some of the smaller municipalities were amalgamated. Now, if you're from Ontario, you would know that in 1997, there was another amalgamation. It was very, very significant, was done under the Mike Harris Conservative governments, and it was so controversial that a number of Conservative Party riding association presidents quit. It was extremely controversial. It's 1997 amalgamation. There was an election that year. I represented Swansea down here, which was amalgamated in 1967. And I knocked on more than one door where people complained about amalgamation. And I said, I know, isn't the provincial government awful? And they said, no, I mean 1967. It was great when we were independent. They took our new fire truck and gave it to Toronto, and they gave us back an old one. So decisions resonate, and I'm not making that up. That's absolutely true, and if you went to Swansea today, you'd still find people who would say that. So there was amalgamation then of the smaller towns, some into Etobicoke, some into Toronto. So that's what Toronto looked like just before amalgamation in 1997. That's some of the planning they were trying to do around transit. I'll come back to that in a minute. And you can see, I wanted this slide here so that people had an understanding of the regions outside Toronto, York, Durham, Peel, and Halton, where a lot of natural areas are. You heard yesterday about the Greenbelt legislation and the Places to Grow Act. Well, the Greenbelt legislation tries to protect a belt across Toronto, roughly from northern Halton across through Peel, York, and Durham. Very important land. A big part of it's called the Oak Ridges Moraine, which is like a big sponge. It's where the water is naturally cleaned and ultimately comes down to Lake Ontario. Extremely important not to have that paved over. And the companion legislation is the Places to Grow Act, which says, essentially, if we're going to protect this green belt, we have to ensure that we grow in the core of cities like Toronto, Oakville, Burlington, Hamilton, and so forth. One of the interesting things, my own personal experience, I'm a rugby player, and the place our games were played is about where the D of Richmond Hill is. And I started playing for my club, the Toronto Saracens, in 1982. And the drive, when you hit the boundary of metropolitan Toronto in 1982, there was basically nothing. There were a couple of subdivisions. And so I've watched in my lifetime, going to rugby games every week, that area be completely paved over. And a lot of it was very well-producing farmland. So it's a very real challenge in the Toronto area, as you're experiencing in Alberta. So that's the background and context for what we were trying to do in Toronto to answer some of these environmental challenges, but we also had an economic issue. For a number of years, provincial governments encouraged jobs to actually move out of Toronto. In fact, I was with a very well-known high-tech employer at the opening of their new facility in Markham, just north of Toronto, and I said, I don't understand why you moved here from Toronto. You know, one of my policies as mayor was to cut business taxes to keep our businesses in the city. If you've read about Toronto politics, you're probably more familiar with the taxes I raised and the new ones I created, but that was for a different reason, and happy to answer questions about that. But this was a deliberate strategy on our part, because over 40 or 50 years, Toronto's tax rates had become double and triple those of the regions around us. And so I said to this executive, why are you opening in Markham and not in Toronto? We've got the employees you need, we've got the infrastructure, you were here before. And he said, it's easy. The province gave me a subsidy to be here, and they wouldn't give me a subsidy to be in Toronto. So we had a very significant challenge with jobs and growth moving outside the city. So there's an environmental challenge, there was a transportation challenge, because the sprawl-based development was all car-based. Transportation around Toronto is terrible. In fact, commute times are about the same as Los Angeles. And you know, Los Angeles is the poster child in North America for poor planning from that perspective. But there's also an economic issue. We're losing jobs, opportunity, and growth. So our official plan, which passed just before I was mayor, tried to address these things by welcoming growth inside Toronto. And it had 3 or 4 fairly simple philosophies. First of all, we had to ensure that our green space remained vibrant. It's a great gift in Toronto. We have these wonderful ravines, which, thanks to the foresight of people after Hurricane Hazel in 1954, were protected from development. 1953, you could build in the Don River, the Rouge River, and the Humber River in my neighborhood. But after Hurricane Hazel killed dozens of people in the Humber River Valley, that was stopped. So we have this incredible asset of natural space. And in fact, in schoolyards near my house, we've seen coyotes on a number of occasions. And I have to say, when you're a local elected official, that's a part of nature you actually don't want happening in your backyard. But it does indicate the importance of these ravines, because they're a connection to wilderness areas north of Toronto and a real source of potential natural experience for Torontonians in the city. So the plan, as you can see from the green areas, very important to protect that. Second philosophy, we want to welcome growth in Toronto, but we want it to be where there is or will be rapid transit. And that's for lots of obvious reasons, I think. You know, to ensure that people can get around, to ensure that you're pushing growth to corridors rather than having it be in stable single-family home neighborhoods. And you can see across here the brown lines are the growth corridors. You can also see they're sort of dotted. There was a little bit of politics. My predecessor, Mel Lastman, couldn't get the votes needed in some areas to have a whole street like Finch Avenue, for example, be a growth corridor, so he took what he could get, which one may be critical of, but at least the corridors are starting to be outlined in this. A third philosophy was, and it explicitly says this in our official plan, we want Torontonians to be able to live and work in this city without the necessity of owning an automobile. And that's one of the reasons the growth is directed to transit lines that exist or will exist, so that people can choose. They don't have to. If you want to drive, that's fine. But we know from our statistics that if people live near a subway or a streetcar, overwhelmingly people choose to take it for both work commutes and short trips in their neighborhoods. So if you build it, literally, they will come. You also create a very positive synergy from a planning perspective. So that there's some other things. You know, we want to preserve industrial land in the city. You know, Toronto, like some other parts of Eastern North America, has seen industry leave. We're quite fortunate because it stayed in the area around Toronto, known as the 905. but a lot of our industry has left. We used to have a GM plant inside Toronto, for example. We still have 22,000 people working in the city in auto parts manufacturing, but that's rare. Most of our new jobs are coming from light industry and other kinds of jobs like IT. But we need to preserve the space for those jobs so that we don't become a bedroom suburb of the suburbs. That was our goal. So that's the official plan. In order to support that, of course, you have to build the rapid transit. And I know in Edmonton you're expanding your LRT lines. I think that's a fantastic project. So those of you here who are from Edmonton, I think you should be very pleased what they're trying to do here. We tried to do the same thing in Toronto, in fact, got it underway. And our goal was to also build by light rail transit. And as you may know, there's some debate in Toronto about whether we should build subways or light rail. And I'll get to that in a minute, but I want to talk about the philosophy of this transit network and why it mattered environmentally, why it matters as an antidote to sprawl, and why it matters from a transportation perspective. From a transportation perspective, in a large city like Toronto, nearly 3 million, the heart of a region of 6, you need a transportation network if people are going to choose public transit. And today we basically have 2 lines, the east-west line, the Bloor line, and the north-south line, Yonge University. And that was fine when Toronto was about 1.5 million. You know, the map from 1967 was fine, worked very well. But as a region of 6 million, it doesn't work. And we need the connections into the region so that people from the region can take transit, and we need a network around the entire city so people can have the option of leaving their cars at home. And that's very important because people don't know necessarily what they're going to be doing after work. You know, you might get a call, you know, maybe your child's going to be late at school or has an unexpected appearance or has to go to the hospital or something, and unless there's a network, you can't be confident that you're going to get home. So what we essentially tried to do was build what needed to be done over 30 years in 5 years. And I ran actually in the 2006 election on a platform that said, I'm going to raise taxes and I'm going to create new ones. That's my promise to you. But my commitment, I was able to uphold that promise, by the way. My commitment is that we're going to take steps to really invest in this city, the investment that hasn't happened for 30 years, and we're going to build a truly great city. My opponent ran on a platform that said, I'm going to freeze taxes and build subways, which is appealing, right? Magical subways appearing out of the sky. And I actually got 60% of the vote. So I think it's a bit of a political lesson there that people actually can respect substance and you can have a conversation that's real and deep. And the result of that was this plan called Transit City, which that election was in November 2006. We developed this under the leadership of Adam Giambrone and the TTC by March 2007. And the Premier of Ontario announced transit funding for this project and others on June 15th, 2007. And I want to talk about that a wee bit because I think people sometimes see somebody from a city as not understanding necessarily rural areas and rural values. The reason we were able to get funding from the Premier for this project was because we worked directly with mayors in rural areas and regional chairs in order to meet their needs as well. And some were the same. You know, there are places within striking distance of Toronto that are going to have bus rapid transit and LRTs that link into this system. Sometimes it was different. But we worked as a group to ensure that we had one ask of the provincial government, and it was a really clear ask about building the infrastructure needed for our city or our town. And it was very, very important because otherwise, if you go to the province, particularly as Toronto, you can get quite marginalized because Toronto is not quite as popular outside its own borders as it is inside its own borders. So on June 15th, the Premier announced funding for Transit City. And I know it was June 15th because that's my wedding anniversary. And a commitment I'd made to Jill when I was elected was that we would always take that day off and spend the day together. We usually went to Stratford and saw a Shakespeare play. So I had to phone Jill. The Premier phoned a couple of days before and said, you know, I want to announce $20 billion in funding for your transit project. Will you come to the announcement? Well, yeah. So I had to phone Jill and say, Jill, I'm really sorry, we can't go to Stratford. Do you mind spending our wedding anniversary at a bus garage in Mississauga? And my advice to those of you who are married is do not have that conversation. So that's the theory behind Transit City, and it was light rail because a lot of Toronto, it is not that dense. Downtown's very dense. But Shepherd East, for example, in Scarborough, goes through an area that simply does not have the density to support a subway, plus subways are somewhere between 3 and 6 times the cost. So that's the project. We then started doing the engineering. Shepherd started construction in 2009. And there's some more to tell in the political story, but that's not why I'm talking about the transit. It's a very strong belief that unless you have this kind of core, you cannot reverse the flow of development out from cities. To bring it back into cities and to ensure we preserve our farmland and our natural spaces, you must have a core of rapid transit. Otherwise, you can't support the kind of development that's needed and the densities that are needed. So this is a developer's mock-up of what Shepherd Avenue is going to look like after the LRT is built. Well, I guess I'll give them credit, although they're not sponsoring my remarks. This is Tridell's slide, which I appropriated from their website. And this is our slide, the cities, and I just wanted to show you this because this shows how Toronto, in many parts of its suburbs, is not very dense. All right, the top line is as it is now. The bottom line is an artist's rendering with the LRT, which will run its own right-of-way down the middle of the line. But you can see that's a very, very suburban place. Typical, parts of Edmonton and Calgary look very, very much like this. And I know Calgary does because the way I paid for my university was paving roads there. So quite familiar with their asphalt. And I do have to add one more thing. Whoops. So don't know if I can... Okay, the place I just highlighted, that is a working farm. There's one left in Toronto. Well, I thought it was important for people to know that. Who knew there was a working farm in Toronto? Okay, Mr. Triplo? No? Sorry. So that's one layer. How do you build in the city to protect natural spaces? You welcome density. And that's part of our official plan. But it wasn't the only thing that we did because if you're not economically and socially successful, you're not going to work as a city. And people are not going to want to live there. And we've certainly seen that in some U.S. cities, like Detroit, which has had terrible problems over the last 35 years. Variety of reasons why people left. But one of the reasons was people weren't economically successful and socially integrated within the city. So in Toronto, we have a challenge that certainly when I moved there in 1981, I never expected to see. And it's a challenge of neighborhoods that have entrenched poverty for generation after generation. That's not a Canadian value. That's not a Torontonian value. We believe in equality. We believe everybody should have a real chance. And we believe that everybody should be part of the fabric of the city. So one of the policies we had while I was mayor, the first thing we did, starting about 2004, was to do research with the United Way, the federal government, the provincial government, the private sector to say, where are these problems the most serious? So that we could have the information we needed in order to ensure that city strategies address the most serious problems. And we came up with 13 priority neighborhoods called priorities because they're a priority for investment. And these neighborhoods are places where there was the largest correlation between poverty and a lack of public services. So if you lived in Rosedale in downtown Toronto and grew up there, you had a great outdoor rink, and you had great schools, and you had a subway, and you had all the public services you could need. If you live in Rexdale in northern Etobicoke, you have very few of those public services. So we identified those as a priority. And it was important from our perspective that if we wanted this city to be the kind of model city I've been talking about, that people from all of these neighborhoods had to be part of the fabric of the city as well. And you'll see that most of them are actually in what we call the inner suburbs. Etobicoke, North York, and Scarborough, the places that were farms 40 or 50 years ago and have been developed since then. There's quite a variety of reasons for that I won't get into, but it's quite interesting. So Toronto is becoming 2 or 3 cities, sort of rings. And there's some quite interesting research that's very worrying about how the core is very wealthy. Outside that, there's a thinning middle-class band, and then we're seeing a large band of poverty. And that's not a sustainable city. It's also not a city that people are going to want to move into. from beautiful towns north of Toronto. And by the way, we found, when I was working politically with mayors from outside Toronto, we found our constituents really had the same views on a number of issues, like nature and the environment. And I think one of the reasons was whether people grew up in farmland or had moved there from Toronto, they expected to have a predominantly rural lifestyle. And they were okay with some development, but when it reached a point where there was too much, they didn't want it anymore. So you can see a lot of the anti-development movement in the Toronto region actually happening in small towns outside Toronto, where it's very strong and powerful. There was recently a successful campaign. A Boston hedge fund bought some potato farms and wanted to turn it into Canada's largest gravel pit. And the community fought back very successfully and stopped them, which under our laws, you're basically able to open a gravel pit with only technical approvals. You don't need any political approval, so it was quite an achievement. And we built on those kind of commonalities politically in order to ensure that we had a very strong agenda that could be effective. So how do the priority neighborhoods work? How does this idea work of treating them as a priority? Well, one of the strategies we thought about was, what's missing? We've got these pockets of poverty with a lack of public investment. Well, more public investment. So we made them a priority for our public investment. They go to these neighborhoods first. But what about the economic opportunity? So we tried to use the levers we could as a city to create economic opportunity for young people in those neighborhoods and communities. And this is an example, although it's not a priority neighborhood, it's a low-income neighborhood, which is the revitalization of Regent Park. And Regent Park's fascinating because it was built after World War II for returning soldiers. So returning soldiers could have affordable housing to live in. And the idea then was, let's create this bucolic community. We'll cut it off from the neighborhoods all around it. We'll cut off the streets so people from surrounding neighborhoods can't drive or walk through it. We'll turn it in on itself and have little pockets of parks inside, and it'll be beautiful and bucolic. And that worked for a little while. But over time, those little pockets of parks became havens for people with criminal activities. The fact that the neighborhood was cut off from the neighborhoods around it meant that the middle-class people who lived around it literally had no interaction with the low-income people who lived in Regent Park. And by the time I became mayor, it was a place with serious safety issues. And the solution was partly a planning one and partly an economic development solution. From a planning perspective, we decided to rebuild the streets so that the community would be reconnected with the communities around it. And we also decided to build middle-class housing within the community. And that came from the people. It didn't come from City Hall. Because right from the beginning, the people who lived there were involved in the discussions about the revitalization. And they said to us, if we get a better job, we don't want to have to leave our neighborhood because we like the people in our neighborhood, we know them. But right now, because this is rent-geared income housing, we would. So can you build housing that we could live in if we get a better job? And that's what was done. And one of the parts of the project, well, I guess two interesting things. The first is when we asked people what they wanted in this neighborhood, the first thing they said was a grocery store. And it's quite an interesting thing because when you talk to them, they said we have to go so far to get our groceries. And there are studies of low-income neighborhoods all over North America that show that groceries are more expensive in low-income neighborhoods. And it does speak to another aspect of these urban-rural issues, which is how do we bring food production actually into our cities and neighborhoods to ensure that there's a supply of healthy food, fresh, healthy food, and to ensure that's economically accessible for everybody. And there's some interesting experiments in that in Toronto and in Brooklyn, New York, where there's a commercial-scale hydroponic farm on the roof of a warehouse called Bright Farms. And it's actually supplying a commercial grocer in Brooklyn with the food from it. So it's one of the aspects I think we need to do more and look at. So the first thing I want, the grocery store. Second thing, a bank. And the third thing I'm going to ask you to guess. It's the third thing that low-income people wanted in their neighborhood they didn't have. Tim Hortons. I'm not making this up. But a really big thing they wanted was jobs for the young people there. So we used a strategy that we used elsewhere in the priority neighborhoods, and because the city ultimately controlled the purchasing, we said to the contractors, 25% of your employees have to be young people from this neighborhood who don't yet have their apprenticeship, who want to get it, and who need the training in order to do that. So we created a program where the money that we were investing to rebuild the neighborhood actually went back into the neighborhood and helped young people get a chance and succeed. And I spoke to one of the contractors and said, how's this going? And he said, you know, Mayor, it was pretty tough at the beginning. I found it very difficult. You know, most of them had dropped out of school. They really didn't have the skills. He said, it took me a while, and it's now the best thing I've ever done. And he was probably about 60 years old, been a contractor for 35 years. So it worked for him as well. Interestingly, we had to demolish some buildings there. And we had a photo op where I got in and I used the demolition machine with a big bowl. If you haven't done that, go do it. Oh, it's so great. It was like living in Triplo all over again. It was just fantastic. So there's a photograph on the front page of the Toronto newspaper with me in a hard hat, you know, knocking down this building. Very next day, stop work order. The Ministry of Labor comes over and says, does David Miller have his papers to drive that machine? Yeah. So then I got hired by the contractor as an apprentice, and no, I'm just kidding. But this is very important, I think, if we're going to try to use the redevelopment and revitalization of cities in the way I'm discussing, you have to ensure that people who live there have opportunity. It's just one technique, but it's one that worked very well for us and was successful. The second one was we had to provide for families. Now, it's a bit different in Ontario, but we're responsible for daycare in Ontario cities. And the City of Toronto is the second largest direct provider of daycare in Canada after the province of Quebec. And under Paul Martin's government, there was a national child care program, and we knew it was coming, or we knew it might, so we prepared a strategy, and we actually opened 63 new child care centers. The majority of them we have two school boards in Toronto, as you may know, public and Catholic, in the Catholic School Board. So right in schools in neighborhoods where people needed it the most. And at the opening of one of them, the custodian came up to me and started crying. And he said, you know, Mr. Mayor, my wife died a couple of years ago, and I have to work till 6. And my son had nowhere to go, and now he does. It was a very beautiful moment for me. But also a reminder that these human services matter. Now, it's different in different provinces, and sometimes this is a provincial issue. But if we don't welcome people as people, and just think about buildings and think about nature, we're not going to provide a way to ensure that people have successful opportunity. So a couple more things I want to discuss from an environmental perspective, and then I'll be happy to take some questions. As was said in the introduction, I was the chair of the C40 group of cities for 2 years, which is an international group of the largest cities in the world working together on climate change. And climate change is of particular interest for mayors, because cities today are bearing the brunt of more and more extreme weather events. That's a very serious issue from Toronto's perspective. Between 2006 and 2010, we had 3 rainstorms, each one of which should only happen every 50 years, which is why we have a wet weather flow master plan, because we're having to rebuild all of our infrastructure in order to deal with these really severe rainstorms. Incredibly expensive. You know, one part of that plan costs $1 billion. And Toronto's total tax revenue in any particular year is about $3.5 billion. So a $1 billion program is hugely expensive. Now, we're doing that work in quite an interesting way. We're using a lot of new techniques, stormwater ponds instead of having everything be concrete. Works incredibly effectively. A lot of lessons, I'm sure, that our water people have learned from some of the presenters here. We're using natural systems as far as possible. But because of that pressure, and if you see, you know, New York after Hurricane Sandy and what Mayor Bloomberg had to do there, you know, people today there are neighborhoods today in New York that are still recovering from Hurricane Sandy. Because of that pressure, and because of ethical and political beliefs, a lot of mayors around the world are working very strongly on ways to mitigate against climate change. And these buildings are emblematic to me of how you bring together environmental, social, and economic policy in a city in a way that ensures people can live vibrant and meaningful lives and connect with nature. So these buildings are concrete slab apartment buildings. And you have them in Edmonton. When Mom and I immigrated to Canada, we lived in Ottawa. We lived actually in a building that looked very much like this one on Kilbourne Avenue in Ottawa. They're all over Canada. And they're all over Canada for a very simple reason. The federal government, post-war, wanted to build housing. In the same way that it supported Regent Park, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation supported buildings like this in every city across Canada. And they were built out of concrete, which is fantastic from one perspective and very bad from another. The fantastic perspective is they're there forever. These are great buildings. And by today's standards, they're big apartments. So they're going to be there forever. It's a 100-year life. And I'm sure when you get to the 100 years, we'll discover they're still structurally sound. That's fantastic. The bad part is that concrete has no insulating power whatsoever. So these buildings are terrible energy wasters. In fact, a one-bedroom apartment in one of these buildings uses more energy to heat and cool than a small house, like a bungalow, which is counterintuitive. You'd think it would be more efficient for people to live together. So some architects at U of T and some engineers at the University of Toronto came up with a strategy to insulate these buildings from the outside, which is very inexpensive. There'll be a payback of between 5 and 10 years, probably 7, and it has dramatic energy reductions. If all of the buildings, there's 1,000 in Toronto, if all of them are insulated, Toronto's energy use will drop by about 5%, and its greenhouse gas emissions by about the same amount. And that's not my figure. That's independent engineers at the University of Toronto, which is a huge amount. So you can save money, lower your environmental footprint, and it all pays for itself in a few years. Great program. We call it Tower Renewal. It's still going on at the city, although because we're Canadian, we started with a pilot project just to make sure it worked. And we haven't got the results back from the pilot, but it's on its way. So great environmental initiative. But how do you connect this with other city policies about social integration, about growth, and about the environment? Well, what we decided to do was actually talk to the people in the buildings and say, like we did with Regent Park, what do you want? What do you want? We have this program that's going to help your buildings be better places to live, cost less, and do environmentally the right thing. So it was quite fascinating with people. They wanted a grocery store. I didn't hear Tim Hortons come up in this context, but I'm sure it did. But a lot of the buildings in Toronto have two common features. A lot have private green space around them. This is true across Canada because at the time the CMHC would give you more density if you had green space, tower in a park. And in low-income neighborhoods, that space is often deteriorating. In addition, in Toronto, a lot of them, like this one, were built near public land, ravines, and river valleys. And when you spoke to the people, they said, you know, we've got all this green space here, but it's disused. Is there a way for us to use that? You know, could we put allotment gardens there? Would we be allowed to grow food? Was there a place for our children to play? And I found a very powerful statement about people's connection with nature in an urban context. You know, they actually wanted to have urban farms in their neighborhoods. And these buildings are fascinating. If you go in some neighborhoods in Toronto, if you want your dentures fixed, you go to apartment 1403. And if you want a haircut, you go to apartment 1266, and so forth. There's real entrepreneurs, very, very diverse, a lot of newcomers typically, entrepreneurial newcomers, from all different cultures. And one of the places they could come together was over food. So it's very interesting that they wanted to take underutilized green space and turn it into what were essentially urban farms, and that's one of the projects they're working on today. But that wasn't all. Many, many of these buildings, as you can see from this slide, these are the clumps of buildings in Toronto, are in the priority neighborhoods. So again, we said, how are we going to bring income, jobs, and resources to these neighborhoods? And in Toronto's case, in Ontario, it's the trade unions that predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly train people for the building trades. And in order to skin these buildings without exterior insulation, you actually need to create a whole new trade. So we worked with the trade unions on the principle that they would help train people, young people, who lived in these buildings in the low-income neighborhoods to get the jobs. And to give you some sense of the jobs, there's 1,000 of these buildings in Toronto. The estimate is that it takes 30 people a year to do an energy retrofit on this building. That's 30,000 jobs. And if an elected official was announcing this, they'd be saying, I'm announcing 30,000 jobs. Very, very important I think it's good to announce 30,000 jobs. I know you find it funny. I'm just kidding. Very important initiative to connect the environmental strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions with the nature strategy to give the opportunity to connect with green space, with the economic strategy to help create employment. And I think that's exactly the way that you build a really great city. You ensure that you've got your environmental policies in a way that connects people with nature. You ensure that your environmental strategies are meeting modern highest standards. And you also ensure that everybody in your city, particularly young people, have a real opportunity. And I felt that if you lived in Rexdale, you should have the same opportunity as you lived in Rosedale. So I want to make one more point, because I talked about the transit plan from the perspective of development and the economy and bringing jobs into Toronto, bringing development into Toronto, fighting sprawl, ensuring that the Greenbelt legislation could remain strong because the development pressure on our farms and on the Oak Ridges Moraine will lessen by having development happen in Toronto. I talked about the need for a network, but the one thing I didn't talk about that's probably actually at the heart of the transit strategy in Toronto is social integration. And transit matters tremendously, because the way transit works in Toronto today and most cities, if you're really lucky, you live near a subway. If not, you're on the bus. And the problem with the bus is that when you're in rush hour, bus travel is just as bad as car travel, perhaps even worse, because it has to keep stopping and picking people up. So if you're on a busy bus route in Toronto where there's a bus every 3 minutes, you will often get 7 buses and then no bus for 25 minutes. And if you're taking one bus, maybe that's okay, but if you have to change, particularly in the middle of the winter, you're going to have real challenges getting anywhere very quickly. And the sad truth is there are a lot of people in Toronto who actually can't afford to run a car and drive it to work because of parking and other costs. So they're stuck on the bus, literally stuck on the bus. So when we were consulting the public about the Transit City Plan, and we had over 80 public meetings, one of the things I did was get out and ride the buses and talk to people. And I took glossy brochures. I didn't mention 30,000 jobs, but I took the brochures and I talked to people. And I started in Malvern, up here. So sorry, I started in Malvern, up there where the red was. And I started there because one of my staff, Clive, lived there. So I said, Clive, we'll come at 6 in the morning and let's see what the commute's like. So we took a bus down to Shepherd. We're going along Shepherd, talking to everybody. It's quite fun, by the way, when you're a mayor, just to go on a bus and talk to people, because nobody expects you to be there. It's fantastic. And I met a woman, and she said, what are you doing here, Mayor? And I said, well, I'm talking about the Shepherd East LRT. And she said, well, what's an LRT? And I said, it's a European-style streetcar. They're beautiful. They're going to run down the middle here, and you'll have rapid transit that gets you where you're going very quickly and reliably. And when it says it'll come 5 minutes, it'll come every 5 minutes. She said, that's great. When's it going to start? And I said, 2009. She said, good. And I said, well, where are you going? And she said, I'm going to work. Where's work? Pearson Airport. Well, if you don't know Toronto, Pearson Airport's here. So to get from where she was here, and she'd been on the first bus. So she took bus, subway, bus. I said, how long does it take you? 2 hours. If I make my connections. She said, 2 hours. And I said, wow, that's a long day. And she said, oh, this is only my morning job. And her afternoon job was here, the Royal York Hotel downtown. She was a cleaner. So she would take bus, subway, a little bit easier, long subway ride. And at the end of the day, subway, bus. Something like 8 bus trips, several subway trips, and probably 4 hours in the day for her just getting to work, minimum wage jobs. And she was probably 40 years old with a family. And if you think about the impact on her from not having decent access to rapid transit, well, first of all, she's probably not going to be home for dinner with her kids. It doesn't impact there on her as a parent. Secondly, she's going to be unable to take advantage of opportunities that she might have to go back to school and upgrade her skills so she doesn't have to have 2 part-time jobs. My mom, when we came from England, although she was a teacher, she wasn't treated as being properly qualified in Canada, which infuriated her, but that's neither here nor there. although I never tried to infuriate my mother. And she eventually went back to school and graduated with her BA when she was 56. And it allowed her a significant boost in pay and to retire in dignity because she went back to school. The woman I met, it's not possible for her to take a night course or something because she's stuck on the bus, literally. And the third thing that she's not part of is the public discourse. As you may know, there's a debate in Toronto about whether we build subways or LRTs. And I do have to make one small political point, and you'll have to forgive me because I'm still a recovering politician. But the debate is about this. Is that red working there? That little dotted line. That's scheduled to be, it's now basically like a Vancouver SkyTrain. It's scheduled to be replaced by an at-grade LRT. And some people want to replace it with a subway, which will serve fewer people and cost probably $2 billion more when all's said and done. So you could either have this little place be a subway, or you can have that be an LRT and have the Shepherd LRT and have the Finch LRT. That's the debate that's going on in Toronto. Personally, I think it's a bit ludicrous. I think you want the network and you provide as much rapid transit as you can, and you should use your money fiscally responsibly and conservatively, is my personal view of it. But that's my view. What about her view? She's the one riding the bus for 4 hours a day. How is she possibly going to get to public meetings and engage in the democratic process and influence people and have the right to speak up and say, I want the LRT because I need it to go to work? She can't. So the transit system in our city is actually helping to exclude her from the democratic debate. So there's an economic issue for her, there's a family issue, and there's a social inclusion issue. And that's one of the reasons that I really feel passionately about the fact that when you're thinking about strategies, whether they're dealing with nature or planning or the environment or the economy or people, we have to look at them all together because they all do connect. And in the same way, the green space outside those apartment buildings with low-income people could be used as urban farms or as passive green space or as a real connection to nature, a place where real nature comes into the city for young people. In the same way that we can use that tower renewal project to create good jobs for the next generation of young people, I think we have to think about all our plans in the same way. So as we're trying to deal with the consequences of sprawl, as we're trying to preserve, in Ontario's case, Class 1 farmland and beautiful parts of nature, we also need to ensure that human beings succeed and thrive. And one of my very great privileges is that I got to fight that battle at the City of Toronto. It's also the philosophy of the World Wildlife Fund Canada. We really try to work on conserving nature in a way that ensures that human beings can thrive. And I think if we can do all of that, we can actually succeed in the kind of goals that you all work on. So that's a little bit of what we were trying to do in Toronto. I want to congratulate all of you for your work. The parts that I heard today were fantastic. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I think we've got a few minutes for questions if there are any. Thank you very much. Thank you.
One microphone right in the middle of the room. I know somebody's going to have a burning question.
And if there aren't, it's okay too.
Here we go.
Hi, thank you very much for that very engaging talk. I have a question about the Regent Park area that
Yes.
you mentioned you made all those upgrades to. I may have missed it, but I'm just wondering what kind of changes have been seen in that area since then.
Well, it's halfway through the revitalization, and I think it's been highly successful. It's by the city's community housing provider, which, as you may know, there have been some political challenges with the last couple of years. But I think it's been very successful, and in some ways the most important part of it was reconnecting the streets to Cabbagetown and the other middle-class neighborhoods around it. I mean, at the time it was done with best of intentions, but now it looks crazy. I take the poorest people in the city and cut them off so they can't access anything else. And certainly from the perspective, the middle-class apartments are in huge demand. And 20 years ago, if you'd said to somebody, there's going to be middle-class apartments that are in huge demand in Regent Park, they would have laughed. The idea would have been impossible. So I don't think it's quite there yet, but it's well on its way to success. And the heart of it was the people who lived there were involved from the very beginning. So it's actually built in their vision, not David Miller's vision or somebody else's, theirs. And I think that's why it's going to succeed. Yes, sir.
Harvey Buckley, would you touch on the economics of what is happening in Toronto? Like, where I'm coming from is I do know your provincial debt is very high. I don't know what the City of Toronto's debt is, but could you just touch on how affordable the style of living you're trying to create is, and what it's going to cost, and where's the money going to come from?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, Harvey, and very fair. I'd say the province's debt is probably not because of political decisions. It is because of a decline in the manufacturing industry and therefore a decline in tax revenue. And manufacturing's still strong, but it's being automated. So there's a lot fewer jobs than there were, and therefore less income tax revenue for the province. From the city's perspective, we have a pretty modest debt. Sound like a lot, it's about $3 billion, but if you look at it from the perspective of how long would it take the city to pay it back, it could all be paid off in 10 years at the current rate. We don't just pay interest, it's like a mortgage, we pay principal as well. So I think for a municipality, that's quite solvent. In terms of some of the bigger projects, City of Toronto faces the challenge of any other city in Canada. Only a tiny part of the tax revenue, overall tax revenue, goes to cities, Toronto's case, about 6 cents out of the dollar. Ottawa takes about $20 billion more out of Toronto each year than it gives back in service. So for the big projects, we rely on some provincial and federal funding. Sometimes it's a third, a third, a third. Sometimes in the case of Transit City, it's almost entirely provincial with a little bit of federal. And I'd say things are relatively sustainable, but in order for the city itself to continue to be economically sustainable, we do need jobs to grow in Toronto and new people to live there, because really the only additional source of tax revenue for a city is new commercial or residential development. So this strategy is actually important not just from an environmental perspective, but for the long-run economic sustainability of the city. Its finances are in pretty decent shape. I'm proud to say I left a surplus when I left in 2010. Disappeared 3 months later, but that's neither here nor there. If you look at the longer run trend, provided we continue to see people moving back and businesses moving back, the City of Toronto itself is in pretty good shape. To get the money to do the big infrastructure, though, you need the help from others.
I was just in Toronto last week, and I grew up in the Beaches area, and I was fascinated to see all of the debate going on there about the Island Airport. And I just wondered if you could comment on two things. One, the interconnection of the transit system to other modes of travel, like the Island Airport and Pearson. But then specifically, do you have a position on allowing jets to land at the Island Airport?
I do. I'm totally opposed to it. I thought Edmonton did an interesting job closing its city center airport, and I think their plans for triple bottom line sustainable development there are really, really exciting. So those of you from Edmonton and environs should be really proud of that work. I think Toronto's challenge is Pearson's not connected by rapid transit to downtown. It's, if you compare it to any major city in the world, Pearson's pretty close. When it's not rush hour, it's a 17-minute drive. When it is rush hour, it's an hour and 17 minutes. But a train can do it in 20. And the good news is that's about to be opened. And I think when that's opened, the commercial use of the island as an airport is no longer necessary from a transportation perspective. And the island is such a great resource. I mean, we've been talking about environmental issues. Do you really want jet fuel being dumped right where the main intake is for your fresh water for a city of 3 million people? I'd say probably not. And the island's a stunning park. It's people who don't have cottages go to the island. You go there in the summer, and as you know, and you see people from all over the city there. So I think over time that use should fade away and it should be restored to natural space. But once you have the train, I think the commercial use should go, just be moved to Pearson. There's capacity there, and the convenience argument's gone. Yes.
Fawn Jackson with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association. And,
Hello.
In our organization, we have seen a large increase in companies such as Walmart and McDonald's and Loblaws and so on and so forth, working with conservation organizations. And I was just wondering if you could comment on our ability to deliver ecosystem services through that market demand type system and the potential limitations you see with that.
Thanks for asking the question. That's something that World Wildlife Fund is really proud of doing. In Canada, we're working most closely with Loblaws about fishing, not so much beef, but from the same perspective. And Loblaws is a great partner. They made a commitment to source 100% sustainable seafood by this year. They haven't quite done it. They got to about 88, but I think we should be really proud of that, because without the target, they never would have got there. And we're working with them, particularly on the Atlantic coast, to help the fishing industry meet that need. So we work with the Fishermen's Union in Newfoundland. We work with a number of fish processors. And I'm very proud to say that one of the cod fisheries in Newfoundland, we've been working with the processor to help him in a fisheries improvement project, and they've just submitted it to be certified as sustainable. You know, cod that virtually disappeared 30 years ago. And I think that's because of the partnership between several levels of business, the people who live there, and an NGO like WWF. I think it's a really great model. And I know in the US there are some efforts to work on beef issues that are through our WWF colleagues in the US, and I think they're coming to Canada a little bit, and I applaud that. There are some risks. You know, if you're an NGO and McDonald's gets in trouble around its employment practices, as it did a couple of weeks, you've got a brand risk. But I think all that can be managed if you find the points of common interest. And our goal is to help sustain nature in a way that serves people for many generations in the future. And there's a good way to use partnerships to do that. And I think our model with Loblaws is a good one to build on. Great, thanks for the question. And thanks very much, everyone, for your time and attention again. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.